Yes guys, I'm Brad. Welcome back to the channel. Of course today we've got the Premier League prediction for game week 30. So it's another weekend in the Premier League bound to be full of ups and downs. There's some big fixtures going on that affects the title race, the top 4 race, the relegation battle. So as always with these predictions I'm going to look at the form of both teams and see who I think will win and who the scorers will be. Just before we get into this video, if you enjoy this sort of content, leave this video a like, subscribe to the channel. I've got some big plans for this channel over the next few weeks. I'm going to try and upload 2 or 3 times, if not more, a week. Of course, as we're getting closer and closer to the end of the season, got my reviews, team of the seasons, etc. And then we've got the transfer window and the World Cup of course coming up in the summer, so I'll be covering as much as I can on them as well as miscellaneous stuff like kit rankings. So if that's your sort of thing, why not leave this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Getting straight into it, there's no Friday night game, no dinner time game on Saturday, so it's straight to the 3 o'clocks. There's 2 3 o'clock kickoffs and the first one is Burnley versus Bournemouth. For Burnley I think they're all but down, I don't think there's much chance of them staying up, if any. As for Bournemouth, they're in contention for the European spots, so I don't think they'll quite get them, I think it'll be mid-table. But of course for a club like Bournemouth that is still a brilliant achievement. Of course both teams had last weekend off because of the FA Cup, but Burnley's last game was a 2-0 away defeat to Everton, a quite lacklustre performance, and it just feels like now Burnley are going down without any real fight. If they'd have got a point or more in that 4-3 thriller against Brentford, then maybe things could be different, but I just think the pain from conceding the last minute and of course the 2 disallowed goals has sucked the life out of them, and I just think now they're going down really without a trace. As you can see for Bournemouth in the last 5 games, of course 4 draws and a win, so I mean if you're a betting man you'd probably put this on a draw. As it happens I'm not a betting man, I'm not going to say a draw, I'm going to go for a 2-0 Bournemouth win. I think it'd be pretty comfortable for Bournemouth, not a thrashing but a decent result. I think the goal scorers will be Tavernier and Krupa. The second 3 o'clock game of Saturday sees Brighton take the long old trip up to Sunderland. I mean I've got to say fair play to any fan doing that, it's probably one of the longest journeys in football at the moment. It's 2 teams having very similar seasons, of course they're not pushing for European places but not getting relegated either. I mean for Sunderland of course that's a brilliant achievement after achieving promotion to the Premier League last year. Of course the second half of the season has been a bit disappointing compared to the first half, but still I'll take that at the start of the season. Whereas for Brighton, being in the top half for the last couple of years, they'll be disappointed to be sat in 14th. But I mean the main thing for Brighton, they're not in that relegation battle, they should be safe, nothing to play for really. Of course Brighton have had more rest for this game because it wasn't involved in the FA Cup last weekend, whereas Sunderland went out in that 1-0 shock defeat to Port Vale. But their form seems very patchy at the moment, a win and a loss, then maybe a draw or a win. But I think after that shock defeat in the FA Cup, Reggie Labour will want his boys firing against Brighton. I can see it's been a very close and tight match. I'm going to go for a 2-1 Sunderland victory. I think Danny Welbeck will open the scoring for Brighton, but goals from Ballard and Mayenda will seal the deal for Sunderland late on. Now weirdly enough, there's 2 games at half-5 due to the Champions League progression. The first of them 2 games being Arsenal versus Everton. Of course the main story of this is Mikel Arteta against his former mentor David Moyes. And after dropping form a little bit, Arsenal got back to winning ways with 4 wins and a draw in the last 5 matches. As for Everton, they're on pretty solid form, 3 wins out of the last 5, including key victories at Fulham and Newcastle away. Of course Everton are well rested for this game. Arsenal play 3 games since Everton's last, but I don't think that'll matter too much. I think Arsenal will get the job done. I just think Arsenal are too strong for Everton at this time. I think it will finish 3-1 thanks to a Gyökeres double and Havertz adding the third. I think Dewsbury Hall will pick up a goal, but it'll only be a consolation. The second 5:30 match sees Chelsea host Newcastle. Of course 2 teams involved in Champions League fixtures this week, Chelsea losing to PSG and Newcastle drawing to Barcelona. Despite being very different results, of course both teams will be full of regret. Of course for Chelsea, letting it slip from 2-2 and 3-2 to 5-2 so easily. At 2-2, 3-2, maybe even 4-2, they have a chance at the bridge. But I think 5-2 gives them a mountain to be climbed. I just don't think they will climb that mountain against PSG. Of course for Newcastle against Barcelona, a team better than them at home, you want to take an advantage going to the Camp Nou. Of course Harvey Barnes got that goal in the 86th minute and they thought they won it until the 96th minute when they conceded a penalty. Of course Jamal converts that penalty, it's all to play for next week at the Camp Nou. Of course Newcastle players especially will be filling the schedule, of course of very congested fixtures at the moment, because of course they had to go for the extra qualifying round in the Champions League as well as being in the FA Cup. And I think Newcastle, especially in the league, are definitely feeling that effect. Chelsea aren't on awful form in the Premier League, of course that last game being a 4-1 away win to Aston Villa. And I think for Newcastle, with their fixture congestion at the moment, I think it's a game too far for them. So I'm going to go for a comfortable Chelsea 2-0 victory. And I think the goals will come from Reece James and João Pedro. Of course the 8 o'clock kickoff was also affected because of the Champions League between West Ham and Man City. Of course this is one on TNT Sports, it was originally due to be 12:30 but it's now 8 o'clock because of Man City at Real Madrid. And of course while we're on about the Champions League, Man City had a very disappointing night at the Bernabeu. Of course the first half, Fede Valverde hat-trick sealed the deal for Real Madrid, what could have been more. Of course Vinny Jr missed that penalty in the second half, it was just a lacklustre night for Man City. And to say they have it all to do at the Etihad next week is an understatement. Of course City before this have been on decent form, their only point drop recently is Forest at home. And for West Ham, they're on decent form as well, of course, progressing to the cup quarters against Brentford, as well as a vital win against Fulham and a decent point against Bournemouth. Of course, West Ham, they're still in the drop zone on goal difference, every game is a cup final to them. And they've got some tough fixtures to come between now and the end of the season. Of course, they're hosting Man City tonight, and they've still got to travel to Newcastle and to Aston Villa. And then, of course, 3 games before the end of the season, they've got to face Arsenal in a big game at both ends of the table. I think for both teams, they need to pick up 3 points in every single match they play from now on. I think if Man City drop any more points, the league is definitely Arsenal's. But if they keep on this winning form, of course, beat Arsenal at the Etihad in a few weeks, then anything could happen. But I think Man City will do exactly that, put the pressure on Arsenal again, win 3-1. I think the goal scorers for Man City will be Semenyo, Cherki and Foden. I think Bowen will grab a consolation for West Ham, but it'll be nothing more. Of course, there's 4 games on Sunday afternoon because of the Europa League and the Conference League. The first of them games being Crystal Palace hosting Leeds. Of course, for Crystal Palace, their attention turns to the Conference League. They've not got too much to play for in the Premier League. Whereas for Leeds, they're sitting 15th in the table, 3 points above the drop zone. And you've got a feeling they'll only need 1 or 2 more wins, then they should be safe in the Premier League. And I think this is definitely a game Leeds will look to try and win. Because I think for Palace, their attention definitely turns to Larnaca away next Thursday. Because of course, they had a disappointing 0-0 draw at Selhurst Park in the first leg. Palace have looked alright in the Premier League recently, of course, a 3-1 away win to Tottenham. And they were doing alright at Old Trafford until Lacroix got sent off and then that game turned around. But Palace are in a position now where the Premier League is almost irrelevant. They just need to try and go into Europe, do the business and see where it takes them. Of course, in the league, Leeds have dropped off a little bit since that resurgence in form. But of course, they had that 3-0 comprehensive victory versus Norwich in the FA Cup 5th round. So I'm sure a quarter-final day against West Ham with a potential trip to Wembley has definitely got them spirited. I think it'll be a close game. I'm going to go for a 1-0 draw. And I think the goal scorers will be Sarr and Calvert-Lewin. The second 2 o'clock game sees Aston Villa travel to Manchester United. Of course, Man United after being out of the FA Cup and not in Europe at all, they've had a good rest. Whereas for Villa, it's straight back to it after a successful away trip to Lille. Of course, Watkins got the only goal in that away trip to make sure they go back to Villa Park with a lead. And I think that'll fill them with a bit of confidence because the Premier League results certainly haven't done that. Of course, they've not won in the league since the middle of February. Of course, a couple of draws and a couple of losses. Of course, there's a massive game in context of the Champions League race. Of course, both teams looking to get 3rd and 4th. And it's looking like that because of the English team doing so poor in Europe, there might not be a 5th place Champions League spot. So both teams won't want to drop points and drop into 5th. Because of course, Chelsea in 5th, 3 points behind, are certainly hot on the tails. Man United have been on decent form recently, despite the last game being a loss. Of course, a very disappointing game, having the man advantage for the full off, then losing in the last minute. It was a very lacklustre performance, but they want to put it right at Old Trafford. And I think they'll do that with a comfortable 3-0 victory. And I think their scorers were Casemiro, Embuemo and Fernandes. The final 2 o'clock game sees Fulham travel to Nottingham Forest. Of course, for Fulham, they've been on decent form, 3 wins in the last 5 matches. But after crashing out the FA Cup, their season is pretty much over. They're going to finish mid-table. There still was a chance of Europe, but I don't think it's going to happen. Whereas for Forest, they're down in a battle at the bottom of the table and they're struggling big time. I mean, the only positive result in the last 5 games is that draw to Man City somehow. Of course, the Liverpool result is expected, but to lose in the last minute is frustrating, of course. But the Brighton result is probably one that frustrates the most, of course, a team that could go and get something from. And then, of course, a disappointing game last time out against Midtjylland in the Europa League. Because, of course, at home, they'd want to try and take a lead or at least a draw going into the second leg. But to lose 1-0 late on is just gut-wrenching. I think Forest woes are going to continue. I'm going to go for a 2-0 Fulham win. And I think the goal scorers were Alex Iwobi and Chukwueze. Of course, the main event at 4:30 on Sunday is Liverpool versus Tottenham. Where do I start with this? Of course, both teams in midweek travelled away in the Champions League. They were picked up losses in the away leg, but one is way more disappointing than the other. Where do we start with Tottenham? Of course, capitulating at Atletico Madrid. Being 3-0 down in the 70th minute, bring your keeper off is not a good look at all. Of course, they lost the game 5-2, no chance of getting to the quarterfinals. And I've got to say, I'm very surprised Igor Tudor is still there. Because, my God, that's a bad loss. Of course, Liverpool suffered a 1-0 loss away to Galatasaray, hoping to turn it around at Anfield. I mean, out of these two, you can definitely tell who the form team is. I mean, Tottenham have lost all the last 5. Of course, Igor Tudor's not got a point yet. Apart from the loss to Wolves, they've had some decent results recently, of course, scoring quite a few goals. And with Romero and Van de Ven missing for Tottenham, I can definitely see them scoring a few again. I can see Liverpool winning 3 or 4-0. I'm going to go 4-0. I think Ekitike will bag a brace, and I think Gravenberch and Salah will get the other 2. And I can see that game being in the Tudor reign. The final game is Monday night, Brentford versus Wolves. Of course, with Brentford last time out was that disappointing shootout loss against West Ham in the FA Cup. Because of course they felt like if they could have beat West Ham, they could have gone to the semis, maybe in the final. But it wasn't meant to be because of Utara missing that Panenka. Of course, Wolves, despite being at the bottom still, are picking up some decent points at the moment, including impressive victories at home to Aston Villa and Liverpool. Of course, the Premier League is the main focus for Brentford now. They've dropped off a bit of form recently. But they're sitting in 7th, 4 points behind Liverpool in 6th. And I'm not sure if 7th will be a European spot. They want to try and secure it anyway. And I think in this game versus Wolves, they'll take a big step towards doing that. I think they'll win this game 3-1 with Igor Thiago picking up a double and Damsgaard getting the other. I think Arakadare will get the goal for Wolves, but it's nothing more than a mere consolation. And there we go, guys. That's my prediction for game week 30 of the Premier League. As always, if you enjoy this sort of content, leave this video a like. Please subscribe to the channel. Any subscribers, any likes, any shares are greatly appreciated. I want to keep growing this channel, keep making it bigger and better. Like I mentioned, 2 to 4 uploads per week is my aim. So stick around if you want to see more content around the Premier League, the Championship, Sheffield United, the World Cup in the summer. But for now, I'll see you guys in the next one.